We want to talk about the alimentary canal, right? So, okay, alimentary, alimentary canal, right? So, what is the alimentary canal? So, this is an organ system. So, this is an organ system, right? Organ system responsible for transporting. So, it's responsible for transporting, right? And digesting, transporting and digesting foodstuffs, right? Foodstuffs transporting and digesting foodstuffs, right? Absorbing nutrients, absorbing nutrients, right? And expelling waste, right? And expelling waste. So that's the alimentary canal, right? So it's a long tube, consists of a long tube that runs from the mouth to the anus, right? So the food that you put in, let's say you eat bread, right? So it travels from the mouth down the esophagus, right? So it's a long tube, it's a long continuous tube. And then there are various processes that will be happening in the alimentary canal, right? Until the food comes out through the anus as waste, right? So there are digestive enzymes that help in the digestion of food, right? So I want to look at the parts of the alimentary canal. So the parts of the alimentary canal include the mouth, right? Start from the mouth here. So this is the mouth, right? The mouth. Then we have the pharynx. So here's the pharynx, which divides into the nasopharynx and then the oropharynx. So the oropharynx continues as the esophagus, labeled A here. So this is the esophagus, right? So this is the esophagus, and then from the esophagus we have the stomach here. So we have the stomach here, right? So it's a bag, right? The stomach, and then from the stomach we have the small intestines, right? So the small intestines. Then these are the accessory organs. Right? This one is the liver, right here. This is the liver. It's called the liver, and then you see this small bag here. So this is the gallbladder, right? So this is the gallbladder here, and then here the small leaf-like organ. So this is called the pancreas. So this is called the pancreas. Then we have the small intestines here, right? So the small here, you can see the small caliber that these are the small intestines. So the small intestines are divided into three, right? So the small intestines are divided into three, right? So the small intestines here, right? Intestines. They're further divided into three. So the first part is called the duodenum. So the first part is called the duodenum, and then the second part we have the jejunum, right? So the second part is called the jejunum, and then the third part it's called the ileum. So the third part is called the ileum. So the small intestine is divided into three parts: the duodenum, the jejunum, and then the ileum, right? So here, this is called the ileocecal junction, right? So it's where the small intestine, the ileum, to be specific, joins to become the large intestine, right? So the large intestine is divided into, so it's divided into three parts, right? So it's divided into three parts. So here, this one going up, remember food moves in a clockwise direction. So the here is called the ascending colon. It's called the ascending colon, right? And then here, the transverse here section is called the transverse colon, right? So here it's called the transverse colon. We can write, okay. So there's the transverse colon, and then here, the one descending here, right? It's called the descending colon. So it's called the descending colon, right? And then there's the cecum. Yes, so cecum is very short here. Where the ileum joins the large intestine, it's what we call the cecum here. There is what we call the cecum. And then here, the small tail-like is what we call the appendix. Yeah. So it's called the appendix. It's tail-like, right? So here, and then of course we have the sigmoid, is what we call the sigmoid colon. And then here's the rectum here. We have the rectum. And then here we have the anus. Right. Right. So here we have the anus, right? So those are the parts of the alimentary canal. Right? They work hand in hand to make sure the efficient digestion of food. Okay. So the gut, right? So the GIT, the gut, so it's 9 meters long. What you need to know, right? It's 9 meters long, about 9 meters long, right? So it's about 9 meters long, right? So it's a very long tube, right? It's a very long tube. So which assists in digestion of food and then absorption of water, right? Digestion of food, absorption of water until it expels the waste, right? Waste product from the body. Okay, so now we want to talk about the first we're going to talk about is the esophagus, right? So first of all, we're going to talk about the esophagus. So the esophagus, let me just put the process that happens in the esophagus. So the esophagus, right? Want to look at the esophagus. So the esophagus is a long muscular tube, right? So esophagus. So it's a long muscular tube. So it's a long muscular. So it's a long muscular tube that runs, right, from the mouth. So that runs from the mouth to the stomach. From the mouth, right, to the stomach. It runs from the mouth to the stomach. So it connects the mouth from the stomach. When you chew food and you swallow, so the food travels the esophagus into the stomach, right? So it moves food down through a process called peristalsis. So there's a process called peristalsis, right? So what is peristalsis? So it is the contraction, it's the contraction and relaxation. So it's the contraction and relaxation of the secular, right, of the secular and longitudinal, of the secular and longitudinal muscles, right, that moves food, down the esophagus, right? So that's the definition of peristalsis, is the contraction and relaxation of the secular and longitudinal muscles that moves down the esophagus. So we said it's a muscular tube. Remember when we said it's a muscular tube, so it is a muscles, right? So there are muscles in the esophagus, the secular muscles here, and the longitudinal muscles. So the secular and longitudinal muscles, they take turns to contract and relax, right? So when the secular muscles contract, the longitudinal muscles relax, right? Right. When the secular muscles contract, right, the longitudinal relaxes. So the antagonistic muscles, the longitudinal muscles relax, right? So when the secular muscles contract, the longitudinal muscles relax, and vice versa. So this antagonistic action will enable food to be pushed down the esophagus, right? Here, let me highlight here. So as you can see here, the secular muscles is the inner layer, and then the longitudinal muscles is the outer layer, right? So here are the regions of contraction here. So food is supposed to move in this direction, indicated by the arrow. So the longitudinal muscles, you can see the longitudinal muscles are contracting here. So you can see they're contracting here, and then the circular muscles are relaxing inside there. So when the longitudinal muscles contract here, they push food, right? So the contraction will push food, the partially digested food. So this is called the bolus. So this is called the bolus. So the bolus of food is pushed down when the longitudinal muscles contract. So they are called antagonistic muscles because they will be opposing the movement, their movement oppose each other. When the circular muscles contract, the longitudinal relax, and then when the longitudinal contract, the circular muscles relax, right? So that's how food is moved down the esophagus. So peristalsis is not only okay in the esophagus, but it also occurs throughout the digestive tract. So it's a squeezing action, right? So this is called a squeezing action, right? So it's called a squeezing. It's a squeezing action, right? So it's a squeezing action that food moves food down the esophagus, right? So now I want to move on and talk about the stomach, right? So I want to move in and talk about the stomach. That's what you need to know about the esophagus so far. So that's the process that happens in the esophagus. So that's a closer look, right? So it's a closer look at the digestive tract. So the stomach. So I'm moving on to talk about the stomach. So the stomach is a muscular bag. So it's a muscular bag, right? It's a muscular bag, right? It's a muscular bag that holds food, right? A muscular bag that holds food and it. So so it is muscles, right? It's a volume. It is elastic, right? So what you need to know is that it is elastic. The stomach is elastic, right? So it's a bag that contains a volume that has a volume capacity of about 1 to 1.5 liters, right? It can carry about contain about 1 to 1.5 liters, right? So what you need to know is that it can stretch because it's elastic, so it can stretch to about 3 times, right? So it can stretch to about 3 times its volume, to about 3 times its volume, right? Or 3 times its volume because it is elastic, right? So it increases when you take a heavy meal, right? It has the capacity to stretch, right? So this is the stomach here from the esophagus here. So this is the stomach here, right? So what you need to know there, this is the body of the stomach, right? And then this is the fundus, right? And then this is the so what you need to know there are sphincters here. So here at the junction between the esophagus and the stomach, and then here at the junction between the small intestine and the stomach, there are sphincters. So here at the junction between the esophagus and the stomach is called the cardiac sphincter. There's a cardiac sphincter, right? And then here between the small intestine and the stomach, it's called a pyloric sphincter. So it's called a pyloric sphincter, right? So the purpose of these sphincters is to prevent regurgitation of food, right? So the cardiac sphincter prevents regurgitation of food from the stomach into the back into the esophagus, right? So that's what happens when this sphincter fails. There's regurgitation of food into the esophagus. So since there's an acidic medium in the stomach, right? The acid that the food that you regurgitate contains acid, right? So that acid goes on to irritate the esophagus, giving you the heartburn sensation. That's why you feel a bit of heartburn, right? It will be food that will be regurgitation into the esophagus, acidic food. So it's that acid that gives you the heartburn sensation, right? So this is pyloric sphincter that prevents the regurgitation of food, right? When food is passed into the small intestine, and it prevents regurgitation back into the stomach, right? So what you need to know about the stomach, right? So the stomach is it contains acid, right? So it's an acidic medium, right? It's an acidic medium containing HCl, right? HCl. So it contains HCl with a pH of about 1, between 1 and 2, right? So it contains HCl with a pH of between 1 and 2, right? So what is the function of this acid? So the acid kills bacteria, right? One, it kills bacteria. Two, it aids, right? So it's not like aids, like, so it is the one that is responsible for activating. So it says activates, right? Pepsinogen. So pepsinogen into pepsin, right? For the digestion of proteins. So digestion of proteins begins in the stomach, and for the digestion of proteins. Digestion of proteins begin in the stomach. So pepsinogen is an inactive form. It is converted by the acid into pepsin, the active form, right? So that's what you need to know. So it's an acidic medium. So it's an acid. There's an acid here. It's an acidic medium, right? So the stomach crushes and mixes food, right? Crushes and mixes food, right? To form, so it forms a semi-solid, right? Called chyme. So it's a semi-solid called chyme, right? So the food, it's being crushed and mixed with saliva and the digestive juices found in the stomach to form this one that is semi-solid called chyme, right? So it is this chyme that is then passed on into the duodenum. Remember, the small intestine, the first part of the small intestine, for small intestine, it's called the duodenum. So it is this chyme that is then passed into the duodenum, right? Exactly. So that's on the stomach. That's the process that happens in the stomach. So digestion, what you need to know, digestion of proteins begin in the stomach, right? That's where digestion begins, right? So want to move on to the small intestine. Okay. So the small intestine is the first part, right? It's the duodenum. So it's just a continuous tube, right? The first part you say it is called the duodenum. First part is called the duodenum, right? And then the second part we say it is called the jejunum. And then the third part is called the ileum. Third part is called the ileum, right? So that's what happens. So what you need to know is that in the duodenum there are two ducts, right? Here, the duct from the pancreas and the gallbladder, right? What happens is this: we have this is the liver. Remember, this is the liver, right? This is the liver, and then this is the gallbladder, right? The bag here, the gallbladder. Right? So this is the gallbladder. So the bile, so it means the liver, remember the liver it produces bile. Bile is stored in the gallbladder, right? And when it's ready for use, the gallbladder contracts, and when it contracts, it releases bile through the bile duct. This is common bile duct, right? So the bile passes through the bile duct here. When it reaches here, the junction, it meets the pancreatic juices from the pancreas. This is the pancreas. So when the bile mixes with the pancreatic juices from the pancreas here, right? So they mix before being poured into the duodenum, right? So that's what we're saying. They mix before being, so they form a common duct, right? So they form a common duct. Yeah. So this is called the ampulla of Vater. It's called the ampulla of Vater. So that's what happens in the small intestine, right? In the duodenum, to be specific, right? So that's what happens in the duodenum. Okay, so and then the large intestine. Want to move on and talk about the large intestine, right? Let me just put a picture that's. Okay, so the large intestine, right? So the large intestine is about 2 meters long, right? So it begins at this junction here, right? This junction here that you see. So this is called the ileocecal junction. So this is called the ileocecal junction, right? So that's where the large intestine begins. So we said the large intestine has three parts, right? So this one that is going up, the ascending part, so it's called the ascending colon. Right? So it's called the ascending colon, right? And then this one, there's the transverse region. It's called the transverse colon, right? So it's called the transverse colon. And then this part that's going down here, it's called the descending colon, right? So it's called the descending colon, right? And then there's the rectum here. So this part, so the sigmoid first, there's the sigmoid colon, what you call the sigmoid colon, right? And then there's the rectum, and then there's the anus, right? So that's how the large intestine is structured, right? So and then there's the appendix here, small tail-like, it's called the appendix. So that's the appendix, right? So it's about the size of a finger, a little finger. That's the appendix, right? So that's the alimentary canal, the parts of the alimentary canal. So the main function we'll talk about the function of the different parts of the alimentary canal when we're doing digestion next. So next we're moving on to digestion, right? So next we are moving on to digestion. So then the main function of the just talk about the large intestine is really wrap up. So the main function of the large intestine or the large bowel, remember the intestines are called the bowel, or the small bowel and the large bowel. So the main function of the large bowel is for absorption of water. That's the main function. It absorbs water. So next time we're going to look at digestion, right? We're going to look at digestion.